For anybody that's just joining us now, this is a special report as we anticipate a judge entering a Glynn County courtroom to give the sentencing for the 3 men convicted of killing Ahmaud Arbery. They've all been sentenced to life in prison, but we're going to find out today if they will have the possibility of parole. So a significant day in this trial. And looking forward, Mr. James, the next phase would be the federal hate crimes trial in this case.
That is correct. It's not over. That would be the next phase, and the federal government always has an opportunity to come in where you have civil rights violations or hate crimes, things of that nature. We've seen it in several situations. I think most notably in the Roddy King trial, the trial of the officers. They were acquitted, in the state case, but they were convicted in the federal case. And so, I expect that things to start all over again. And this time, I think in the next trial, there's going to be evidence on what they said. I think one of the investigators, perhaps from the GBI, was talking about some of the gentlemen using the N-word and making some other racial slurs. And that case is going to be about not just what they did and whether or not they were guilty of murder, but why they did it.
Yeah, we will hear much more in this next phase than even we did in the prior phase, and there was a lot of new information that came out during the course of what we saw unfold in the courtroom. Talk me through a little bit of this Georgia law that designates this power to hand down the sentence to the judge instead of the jury. You talked about the significance of the jury makeup and maybe even the surprise from many of the outcome in light of that. But when a jury gets called to go through this process, some may not realize that they wouldn't be the ones in Georgia determining the sentence.
Well, in Georgia, the jury doesn't sentence, and I know that's different than some places. They don't sentence. The only time a jury hands down a sentence in Georgia is when it's a death penalty case. It's a bifurcated case, and they have to decide whether or not, the person is going to get the death penalty or not. Other than that, it's a judge that decides to sentence. We also have schemes in the law, what they call statutory schemes, which is basically how the state legislature writes the law in Georgia that sometimes adds what we call mandatory minimums or a guideline or a floor beneath which the judge cannot go beneath. And so what I mean is that in Georgia, for a charge like murder, there's only one sentence, or the bottom of where a judge could go would be life. And so this judge is not like he can come back and say, you know what, I think they're good folks, I'm only going to give them 5 years in prison, or I'm only going to give them 10 years in prison. So for the people that were convicted of murder, they cannot get less than life in prison. In Georgia, what that means is that you're going to spend 30 years in prison before you're even able to go before the parole board. The judge can also say, you know what, this was aggravated, this was really horrible what happened, it was horrible the way that you did it, this was racially motivated, and consider a lot of aggravating factors and say, you know what, you deserve life without parole. So the judge can go beyond life, where they would be eligible for parole in 30 years, and say, I believe you deserve life without parole, which means you will never get out of prison.
When you think about the many layers of this case, Mr. James, I was just thinking back to when former Glynn County District Attorney Jackie Johnson was arrested in books for violation of oath obstruction in relation to the Ahmaud Arbery killing, because she did not initially pursue this case at all. She was indicted by a grand jury. There are so many layers. Do you see any lasting changes that could come because of what we have seen here?
Well, in my experience as a prosecutor, whenever you have a high-profile case that sort of pulls the cover back on some of the things that have happened in this case, like, the way the prosecutor allegedly handled the case, before it was passed on, and the reason it was passed on, and also how the prosecutors, I don't want to say meddled, but how they basically passed the case on and then directed the next person or advised the next prosecutor's office on how to handle it. I wouldn't be surprised if there were some laws that came, or some bills that came out of the legislature, proposed laws that said, listen, as a prosecutor, if you conflict out of a case, you can't direct how it's going to be handled. You can't, or even advise how it's going to be handled. The other side of it, I think, which is what the prosecutor in Brunswick, caught a lot of flack for and perhaps got in trouble for, was instructing the police not to arrest. And as a prosecutor, that's not your role. Your role is to advise the police, but it is not to instruct the police. They're a separate, independent agency. And I don't know that there needs to be a law to prohibit that, but I think that it's a lesson to most prosecutors to stay out of police business.
Wanda Cooper, Ahmaud Arbery's mother, said had it not been for that cell phone video, she doesn't believe there's any way that we would have come to this day. The cell phone video showing moment by moment all that had happened there in Brunswick, and was such a key piece of evidence in this conviction, and as you pointed out, will also be a key piece of evidence in the hate crimes trial, even down to conversations and audio. I guess it shows, Mr. James, how critical, this kind of evidence is at a time where we record all that happens around us.
You're absolutely right. We would not be here had it not been for that videotape, had that videotape not surfaced. We just would not be here, right? It would be a young black man that was killed in a community where he did not leave. And, the narrative would have been told by, his assailants, his murderers, so, look, dead men tell no tales. And the people that live are the ones that are able to tell what happened. And so listen, this would have been over with. And so the fact that there was video in this case, that's the reason that we're here. And that just speaks to where we are in today's society, that you're always being taped. In terms of the federal hate crime trial, the video is going to be extremely important because, again, hate crimes aren't necessarily just about what happened. It's about the motivation for it happening. And so we know a murder took place. We know we know that they killed Ahmaud Arbery, but in a hate crime trial, the question is going to be, why did they kill Ahmaud Arbery? Yeah. Was it because they were afraid? Was it because of their mistaken belief in, in citizens' arrest? Or was it because, they were targeting him because he was an African-American in their community and they felt like he didn't belong there? And some of the comments that were made subsequent to this murder, using the N-word and things of that nature, that's going to weigh heavy.
For those of you who are just joining us, I'm talking to former DeKalb County Prosecutor Robert James, who's been following the Ahmaud Arbery case all from start to finish. We are awaiting sentencing for the 3 men convicted in his killing. Travis McMichael, who was the one who pulled the trigger and shot Ahmaud Arbery, his father, and William Roddy Bryan will be sentenced in a matter of moments. Clinton County Court had let us know it was going to happen right at 10 o'clock. They may be doing some housekeeping, getting things ready. They understand the magnitude of this moment and how the eyes of the country are watching what happens there in Brunswick. From all that happened inside the courtroom as you watched so closely, was there a moment or two perhaps that really stood out to you as pivotal moments to get to the conviction and then to a sentencing date where we are today?
Well, I don't know that there was any, one moment in particular. I think that there were multiple moments. I think that everybody was, and just like in every criminal trial, this was really no different, except for the fact that it was high profile. When a defendant decides to testify, oftentimes that can move the case in one way or the other. And clearly, I think that the jury listened to everything that the defendant said in this case, and they just didn't believe him. They didn't find it credible. And I don't think he did it himself any favors, by testifying. 2 of the other defendants decided not to, and I understand that. And they were probably advised by their counsels not to do that. But I think in a case where a defendant decides to testify, that's almost always the most pivotal moment.
I was just looking at some notes from inside the courtroom. We have teams that are covering this. They say the 3 defendants are sitting in the same seats from trial next to their attorneys right now. And our reporter says that Greg McMichael looks noticeably nervous, is in quotes. He said he greeted his attorney but seemed very nervous as he took his seat and made a note that he had a trembling hand over his mouth. So you mentioned the emotion in the courtroom. That is certainly the case on both sides. Wanda Cooper is now in court as well, according to our team inside. Lee Merritt, Wanda Cooper Jones's attorney, is there on the as well. Marcus Arbery and Ben Crump are also in the courtroom as well. And outside, a lot of clergy and supporters who have been there since day one and made that commitment to be there from day one. And then today at a vigil before the proceeding here made the commitment that they will continue to be there to support the Arbery family through the federal hate crimes trial. For people who are wondering the distinction here between life in prison and the possibility of parole, for a judge, is there a determining factor that would make the decision about whether they ever see the light of day again as free men?
You know, I think he's going to look at the totality of the circumstances. I think he's going to look at how the crime was committed. He perhaps may even look at why the crime was committed. You know, typically in the cases as a prosecutor, when I was the DA in DeKalb County, where people received life without parole, there was something significantly aggravating, such as a murder for hire, or there was torture involved. You know, in this case, you don't have either one of those factors, but what you do have is something that, you know, I think the prosecution is going to assert was racially motivated. You know, and so I think that you're going to hear that from the prosecution if they in fact ask for life without parole. You know, and, you know, there may be some other things, you know, that come out as well, but I think that may be the strongest chip or, you know, the strongest card in the prosecution's hand. On the other side, you know, when, as a defense lawyer, when you're asking for a judge to be lenient, to be merciful, you know, you're going to talk about, you know, the background in law enforcement by some of these individuals. You're going to talk about the lack of criminal history. And you're also going to instruct your clients to pretty much humble up, as it were, to come in and just be as humble as possible. You know, this is not the time for defiance, right? You know, your whole life literally is in the hands of this judge. And, you know, and you're also going to want character witnesses to come in and say, you know, these are good people that just perhaps made a bad mistake.
And the judge understands the pressure that he's under, the scrutiny that the judge will be under as well in a case like this. I know that their position is to not consider any of that. Do you think that plays into a trial at this point, at a sentencing phase?
You know, look, I think judges are human, right? As much as they would, you know, make you, you know, believe that, that they're not, they're human. As a matter of fact, I think the humanity in them makes them good judges. You know, because we want, we don't want people doing the same thing in every case, because not all cases are created equal. I think ultimately, you know, whether we agree with it or not, you know, this judge is going to go and look at all the facts, look at all the evidence, and he is going to do what he thinks is right. You know, I've watched the judge during the course of the trial, and he's called this case pretty fairly. You know, like we say in trial law, he's called balls and strikes the way he's seen them.
Even in some kind of jaw-dropping moments in the courtroom, most notably perhaps when the lawyers for the defendants were talking about not wanting to see, quote, another black preacher in the courtroom. I mean, this trial came with some kind of incredulous moments. You would hear analysts talk about those moments that the judge had to navigate.
Yeah, it was terrible, right? You know. I understand why they did it from a legal standpoint, but it was very distasteful, and I can understand why the public and Mr. Arbery's family would be upset about it. From a legal standpoint, they're trying to create error. They're trying to say that all of these black preachers, as it were, in the courtroom, that they were influencing the jury, that the jury could see them. You know, the problem with that is that the courts are public. And so anybody, as long as they're not being disruptive, can come in there and sit and watch a trial. You know, so it's not as if they had, you know, they were sitting in the courtroom on the front row, you know, raising a fist or with Black Lives Matter shirts on. They were sitting there like all the white people in the courtroom, you know, and so, you know, I understand what he was trying to do. I just don't agree with it. You know, there were also some comments from counsel, you know, I think that were disparaging, you know, comments about Ahmaud Arbery and closing argument that I think, you know, people won't soon forget, about dirty fingernails and toenails and things of that nature. You know, I've tried high-profile cases. I've tried cases aggressively and against aggressive attorneys. I just don't think that was necessary.
The defendants' lawyers argue they could not get a fair trial, in part because of the publicity surrounding this case, and moments after the verdict came down, we're already saying, yes, there will be an appeal. What are your expectations for that part of maybe a next step? Well,
look, there's going to be an appeal. And as I see it, there's probably going to be three areas One will be, what went on inside of the courtroom that wasn't necessarily the trial, which would be the black pastors, as it were, or whomever else sitting in there. The other will be pretrial publicity, that they could not get a fair trial. And then the third area will be all the stuff that they wanted to dig up and bring into court about Ahmaud Arbery's past and, alleged mental health issues and things of that nature. I think the judge was on point in all three of them. I follow, and I've commented publicly, on all three rulings that the judge made, and I think he was right on all three areas. I think Georgia law is well settled on all three areas. I expect there to be an appeal, but unless the Supreme Court makes new law, which they're entitled to do, but unless they make new law, I expect that this conviction will be upheld.
All right, again, we're talking to former DeKalb County Prosecutor Robert James, who's been following this case from start to finish, as we are expecting the judge at any minute. Again, it was slated to come down, the sentencing that is, at 10 o'clock, and we are in kind of a holding pattern. We do know that representatives, including the defendants and the family of Ahmaud Arbery, have all taken their seats inside that courtroom in Brunswick, which is in Glynn County, southern Georgia. We are just waiting on the judge. We have cameras inside, we have teams inside and outside, as we've anticipated this day. 42 days after the guilty verdict comes the sentencing day.